The Boss, Bad Scooter, the single person who most embodies the spirit of American rock and roll, Bruce Springsteen. In addition to being an American icon and one of its most prominent civic voices, Bruce Springsteen is one of popular music's most fascinating artists, for a number of reasons. The first and most important reason is because he's produced an enormous amount of incredibly powerful music. The second is that he is the living embodiment of the American dream in a rock and roll context. He came out of nowhere and clawed his way to the top of the music industry by dint of sheer artistic will. The third reason, which for me as a singer-songwriter is one of the most interesting, is that his compositional style has changed quite dramatically over the years. He started out writing these incredibly verbose, incredibly technically complicated songs, which gave way to a more mechanically simple style of writing whose value hinged more on the message of the songs than their technical experimentation. Now, admittedly, as a singer-songwriter, I am quite excited by technical experimentation, but there's just something about Springsteen's sheer devotion. He is trying to write into the heart of American masculinity. He is trying to write into the unbalanced equation that people like him had to grow up under, being a member of a working class that promotes many fewer people than the American dream would lead you to think that it does. He's been so devoted for so long to writing about topics that are incredibly difficult to write about that I'm just simply in awe of the effort, the devotion, the longevity. I love Bruce Springsteen. I've learned a lot from him as a musician, a songwriter, a performer, and so just like I did for Bob Dylan, I'm going to dive into my takes on his studio albums. Depending on your level of interest, my level of interest, and your level of satisfaction with my new and improved studio setup, maybe I'll get into the more off-the-beaten-path stuff later, his live albums, his vault cleaning exercises, etc. But for now, we will start with the studio album. Before we get going, please be sure to like this video and subscribe to my page. In addition to offering commentary on the music that has shaped me, I also share a lot of my own original music, as well as me covering the songs that I'm talking about in these videos.
I'm going back out for the rain starts a-falling. I'll walk to the depths of the deepest dark forest.
Visit my channel to see and learn more. Alright, Bruce Springsteen studio album tier list. Let's go. One, Greetings from Asbury Park, New Jersey. I have a lot of fondness for this album. You get this a lot of the time with an artist's debut work. There are so many different styles that are present at the same time, so many different potential roads of specialization that the artist could go down, and they don't really know which one is going to be the main road yet. In the context of popular music, this album may be the best example of that. He is trying so many different things on this album all at the same time. He's got like coffeehouse solo acoustic songs like Mary Queen of Arkansas. He's got these elaborately arranged band songs like Does This Bus Stop at 82nd Street. He is trying to write the most Dylan-esque verbose lyrics that he possibly can. Look no further than Blinded by the Light for proof of that. He is trying to write at maximum musical complexity, maximum stylistic complexity, maximum verbal complexity, all at once. And the results are kind of mixed, you know? It's a classic case of an artist, their first time out of the gate, trying to be all things to all people. If you're a fan of poetry, he wants you. If you just want to go to a bar and have a fun time at a show, he wants you. If you want to go to a coffee house and have sort of a mellow contemplative evening, he wants you as well. There were a lot of people then, and there are a lot of people now who view this as not only admirable, but successful in its effort. I am not really one of those people. I think that it is periodically successful and often overreaching. Not necessarily even overreaching, but reaching for too many things at once. Not to say that I don't admire the adventurous, I really do. But there's a difference between admiring adventurousness and being moved by it, you know. I'm a big lyrics listener, and that lyrical complaint extends to a number of the other songs on this album. For You, Does This Bus Stop at 82nd Street, Lost in the Flood, Spirit in the Night. The lyrics are just, they're just waterlogged with alliteration and with rhyme and with, you know, sort of silly monikers for young New Jerseyans. Again, I admire the adventurousness. I'm often not moved by it. It's always interesting to do this kind of evaluation now with the full context of their discography in the rear view, because you know where they would go, and I know how Bruce Springsteen would refine these lyrical approaches over time, and I find the refinements more interesting than these first raw experiments. I see the necessity of these experiments, but I find the refinements more effective. You know, the album also suffers a little bit from the production quality. My understanding is that Springsteen didn't want to blow all the money from his advance from Columbia Records on the production, and so he elected to record it in a less expensive studio than he might otherwise have done. And, you can hear it in the production. The production is pretty thin. The vocals in particular are not as rich and deep and large as we would come to expect and enjoy from Springsteen. And for what was really quite a raucous and energizing band, it just sounds a little dead in this room that they recorded it in. Again, I can hear the Springsteen bloodhounds barking at me when I say stuff like that. But, it's like, let's just be real about it. Like, there's so much to admire here. And there is so much that just circumstantially, both Springsteen being as young as he was and, him being in the position vis-a-vis his record company that he was, he couldn't do to the ideal length, to the ideal extent that he would in the next couple of years. So, there's so much that I like about this album. I love the song Growin' Up. Growin' Up has a very My Back Pages quality to it. I think the lyrics there are more effective than anywhere else on the record. I like For You. I like the songs that really have heart, The other thing that I'll mention here is that most of these songs sound a lot better live than they do here in the studio. The Springsteen live album that I particularly cherish is the one from 1975 live at the Hammersmith Odeon. In particular, Spirit in the Night and Lost in the Flood just absolutely shine on that recording. What that emphasizes to me is that this production environment was so far from the ideal production environment in which to capture these songs. There is so much of value on this album. There's so many indications of the artist that Springsteen would grow into very shortly thereafter on this album. Is it in and of itself a masterwork? No, I don't think so. Is it sort of a snapshot of embryonic genius? Yeah, I think you could argue that it is. As an artistic document isolated from the rest of his material, I think I would put this in Springsteen's B tier. 2. The Wild, the Innocent, and the E Street Shuffle. Fascinating about this album is that it was released in the same year as Greetings from Asbury Park, New Jersey. And to my mind, it is a giant leap up in quality in a number of different areas. Production quality is an obvious one. The album just sounds so much fuller, richer, deeper than Greetings from Asbury Park does. But then also compositionally, I find these compositions just so much more mature and focused than the compositions on Greetings from Asbury Park. I remember him saying somewhere that he was put off by the Dylan comparisons after the first album and wanted to write in a way that was more distinctively him, which I completely get. And I'm just astonished at how successful he was at doing that. Whereas Greetings from Asbury Park's songs are sort of these impressionistic landscape paintings. I know that's kind of a paradox, but go with me. Impressionistic landscape paintings of Asbury Park. This is a little bit more like a sort of hyper-realistic, hyper-detailed painting of the same scenes. With characters, with stories, all of them sort of colliding at once with each other and producing wild chemical reactions. I made the point about admiring adventurousness versus being moved by it in the previous album. I'm much more moved by it here than in Greetings from Asbury Park. The songs really are no less adventurous. I just think he chooses where to be adventurous a little bit more effectively than the last album. The last album, it's everywhere at once. This album, it's mostly in the structure of the songs, as opposed to in the lyrics of the songs as well. Rosalie to Come Out Tonight is the obvious example, but really look at Wild Billy's Circus Story. It has all the sort of madcap narrative detail of a Tom Waits song, but it also has this incredible beating heart at the center of it. It's the production is really astute, really intelligent. The tuba is a really tasteful choice, and the song has just so many different musical sections in it, all of which come together to produce this incredibly coherent image of a circus. Springsteen would often introduce Rosalita as the best love song he ever wrote. And yeah, Rosalita is one of several songs on this album that produces such ecstatic emotional highs in me, and it has for a long time. Rosalita does that, the E Street Shuffle does that, 4th of July Asbury Park does that, Incident on 57th Street does that. Notably, what does not do that for me is New York City Serenade. I really don't like that song. It's an example for me of something I'm going to bring up a lot in Springsteen albums that I do not enjoy, which is the term bathos. It basically means going for a big effect and kind of missing the mark, and the big effect becomes trivial instead of sublime. New York City Serenade is a perfect example of that. I find the chantings of Listen to the Junk Man silly. I find the intro long and drawn out and sort of failing in its emotional reach. I don't like that song. I really don't like that song. Which is a shame because I otherwise consider this album kind of like Dubliners. Like it's kind of a brilliant collection of short stories focused very, intently and in a detailed fashion on the author's hometown. Incredibly adventurous compositions, incredibly adventurous arrangements, most of which are so successful. And then there's just this one at the end that I think is so unsuccessful. In summary, this is the Springsteen album I've probably listened to the most times. I don't know if it's the best work start to finish, but again, this I would say is the album that is most technically experimental and successful. Asbury Park is probably a little bit more experimental, but it's less successful. This is ever so slightly less experimental, but substantially more successful. I would put this one high in Springsteen's A tier. 3. Born to Run. This is the album that turns Springsteen from an interesting minor artist into a major artist. This story does not end there. His battle for prominence did not end there. It only gets more complicated from here. This is the album that famously put him on the cover of Newsweek and Time in the same year, in the same week or something, at a time when that really meant something. Kids. Born to Run was a huge radio hit. This album vaulted him into a sort of national or international popularity that he had not really had up to that point. So this tremendously, really a turning point in his career. And it is probably the earliest example of Springsteen the legend that we have. His first two albums are incredible examples of his genius. This is where it first sort of coalesces into legendary writing, recording, performing. That's the way it's thought of, and in many cases I would say its reputation is entirely accurate. The title track is as brilliant a rock song as has ever been written or recorded. Thunder Road, likewise. 10th Avenue Freeze Out, likewise. Jungle Land, likewise. All of those songs belong in the classic rock pantheon that they generally are considered to reside in. Now, for the rest of the album, this album has some clunkers to me. I mean, I don't think this is a perfect album. I don't think it's great all the way through, honestly. I think that Meeting Across the River is kind of a dud of a song. Again, it has that kind of bathetic energy to me, where it's like trying to conjure this sort of noirish, Godfather-ish, tense gangster scene, and it just ends up feeling a little silly to me. The trumpet, I think, is ill-advised. The dialogue, I don't think, is that well-written. It's certainly nothing more evocative than in gangster films of the day. Both Night and Backstreets start to feel like generic Bruce Springsteen songs. Compare Night to the track Born to Run. Born to Run has so many different ingredients working together simultaneously. It has hope, it has desperation, it has this sort of disorienting middle section, it has this incredibly powerful production atmosphere. Night just feels like it isolates one of those variables and makes a whole song based on that. Like, just the sort of highway desperation is all I feel in Night. And it feels redundant next to the incredible consummate achievement that Born to Run is. And Backstreets likewise. Like, Backstreets is a simplified version of Jungle Land. Jungle Land is about people hiding and fighting and loving and dying on the back streets, and then Backstreets is just sort of like a very simplified distillation of Jungle Land's energy and scope. I really don't love those songs. I don't love those three songs. She's the One is the only one I haven't mentioned, and I do love She's the One. I think She's the One feels like a perfect modernization of the rock and roll that Springsteen grew up with. Anything from Bo Diddley to Elvis to the Ronettes, it feels like it so gets and grows upon the energy of that early rock and roll. I love She's the One I love. It's interesting with this one. You can track a very interesting progression from Asbury Park to The Wild, the Innocent, and Born to Run. If Asbury Park is him trying everything at once, and then The Wild, the Innocent is him sort of picking one or two things and doing those really well, Born to Run is a further distillation into what is probably the ideal Springsteen compositional style. Thunder Road is actually maybe the best example of it to me. Born to Run is the perfect version of that for a radio hit. Thunder Road to me is the perfect example of that, just Springsteen writ large. It's maybe his best song. It is formally interesting, it is poetically strong, it is ecstatic in its energy, it's intelligent in its production. It is the perfect leveraging of Springsteen's unique genius in all four of those realms. But I don't think this is a perfect album. I don't think it's the perfect album that people generally regard it as. I mean, when it comes time to rate this, on the one hand, the best compositions are as strong as any in Springsteen's catalog. On the other hand, it has some very weak tracks, in my view, that really make it an imperfect album. I would put Born to Run cautiously in the S tier, because it's the pinnacle of his compositional style in many ways, but it's also not a perfect album, you know. So I cautiously in the S tier, I would say. 4, Darkness on the Edge of Town. It took 3 years between the release of Born to Run and this one, and largely that's because of legal disputes that Bruce Springsteen was having with his former manager, Mike Appel. And, you know, it kept Springsteen on the road and out of the studio for the better part of 2 years. I can picture as a young, ambitious, hungry recording artist that being kept out of the studio for that long would just be absolutely infuriating, suffocating, constricting. So by the time he got back into the studio, he had several trunks full of songs to record for it, and he recorded a lot of songs for this album. Yeah, I mean, what we see here is almost a laughably small snapshot of the number of songs he recorded for this album. Just like Born to Run, he agonized over this album. I think he's a perfectionist in general, so his inclination is to agonize, but he really agonized over this album. And, you know, in a lot of cases pretty successfully. I think what Born to Run led us to believe, Darkness on the Edge of Town confirms to be true, which is that the pinnacle of Bruce songwriting are these anthems that can be sung en masse in a stadium. Take for an example Born to Run, and take for an example Badlands. Songs with giant choruses played at a medium tempo, you know, simple melodic hooks, and that you can sing with the full volume of your American lungs. And when he carries it off successfully, it's as powerful as any singer in the history of rock and roll. When he doesn't connect, though, that mission does a lot less for me emotionally than the mission of a more poetic songwriter like Bob Dylan. And when I say poetic, what I mean is somebody who is preoccupied with linguistic experimentation. Not that Springsteen isn't writing poetic lyrics, but the goal of his poetry is different than the goal of Dylan's poetry. Dylan's poetry is constantly trying to turn language itself inside out. Springsteen's poetry is trying to shine a light into the working class factories, houses, bedrooms of America. Neither is inherently more valuable than the other in my view, but Dylan's resonates more with me as an artist and as a listener. Now, having said all that, there's still quite a bit of compositional experimentation on this album. Adam Raised a Cane is a great example of that. Springsteen's guitar parts on that album are reminiscent of I Can See for Miles. The one-note tremolo guitar solos. Adam Raised a Cane is also just a great song about fathers and sons. I mean, the energy of it is as desperate as it feels to fight with your dad when you're 16. The lyrical refrain is brilliant. You know, a man fallen from grace raises a child who has evilness inside of him, inherent in him. If you can, you should listen to that song and listen to The Promise, because the Promise is really about, if Genesis is where man falls from grace, The Promise is where Bruce Springsteen's dad falls from grace, and where the tragic evil that produced Adam Raised a Cane is born. Candy's Room, I think, is a great depiction of the desperation of lust that you kind of have nothing to do with at the moment except just seethe. The Promised Land and Prove It All Night are both great anthems. In particular, Prove It All Night is a terrific anthem. What I also like about this album is that the closing track, the title track, gives you a sort of interpretive framework for the rest of the album, in the way that the movie Badlands is kind of about suburban malaise, you know, the kind of desperation it takes to destroy suburban malaise. The way that I interpret the phrase Darkness on the Edge of Town is that's what produces that suburban malaise. You're insulated from the darkness of the land, but you're completely aware that it's there. And it makes you curious about it, and, you know, what is this sort of bizarre American experiment trying to insulate us from? Is it our nature? Is it freedom? True freedom? What exactly is out there beyond that darkness? And I want it, but I'm also terrified by it, and what happens if I step into it, etc., etc. What I'm really trying to say is that song, placed where it is, provides a really wonderful, helpful, thematically impactful interpretive framework through which to view the rest of the album. Now, again, there are some things about, you know, there's some sort of very typically Springsteen-ish things that I don't like about this album. I'm not really a fan of Something in the Night. I find his piano ballads kind of boring. It's the same issue I have with Tom Waits. Like, I think they just sort of have this mode of slow emotional piano ballad, and it's very similar song to song. I'm aware that there are some lyrical and thematic things that distinguish Something in the Night from Racing in the Street, for example, but given the similarity of the energy, it's hard for me to feel uniquely moved by one or the other. How different is Streets of Fire from Backstreets on Born to Run? You kind of worry at this point that Springsteen is falling into compositional ruts, where he's beginning to write the same song over and over again. It's not the case on the entire album by a long shot. I mean, as I said, there are quite a few songs that I really enjoy on this album. And I would say on the whole, I really like this album. Something in the Night does not do it for me. Factory doesn't really do it for me. It's not an album that I get as much raw pleasure from as either Born to Run or The Wildly Innocent and the E Street Shuffle, but it's an album I admire very much. I admire both the idea and the success of the idea motivating it to capture that suburban sort of working class desperation. I think it does a really good job of that, with a number of anthemic Springsteen-y type moments throughout it. I would put it in his A tier, just behind The Wildly Innocent and the E Street Shuffle. 5. The River. The way that I've always heard this album is it's Springsteen sort of getting a monkey off of his back. He spent the 1970s becoming a prominent voice in popular music, proving to the rock-listening world that they ought to be listening to him. Not just people along the Jersey Shore, but people everywhere. And he encountered a lot of difficulties along the way. I mean, from the construction of his band, to his relationship with his managers, to his relationship with Columbia Records, not to mention the fact that Springsteen came from nothing. He didn't have a raft of family money that he could float on as he was getting to that point. He was plunging himself into debt, he was building and destroying relationships, he was digging upward through miles of rocky earth. And so at the end of all that, The River is this monstrous album, and it just feels like the ebullience of breaking the surface, of seeing just a little bit of sunlight filtering in through a crack in the cave, and just plowing through it with all the strength you've got. And, fundamentally, this album rocks. I have to think that Springsteen was really influenced by The Clash on this album. London Calling had come out not long before this, and it too is a sprawling, magnificent double album full of raucous punk energy. And I mean, Springsteen will never be a punk rocker per se, but to the extent that he ever has been, this is it. It's very stripped down arrangements, very simple compositions that just have all of the energy of youth and cynicism and wanting not to be bogged down and saturated by cynicism in them. The Ties That Bind, Sherry Darling, Two Hearts, Out in the Street, Crush on You. I mean, there's so many songs that present themselves as punk-infused rock songs that will make you feel great, and do. A lot of people have commented something to the effect of, I stopped listening to Springsteen after Born to Run. The reason for that must be that Born to Run and before, the complexity and depth of the music is so superficially evident, meaning that the compositions are very complex, the verbiage is very complex. If you're somebody who listens for and enjoys complexity, it's easy to see how you can get into those albums. As his compositions simplify, it's a little bit harder to see that, but Hungry Heart is a good example of that. Contrast the feel of Hungry Heart with the actual lyrical content of Hungry Heart. It feels like a sort of sunny summer day, aren't we all best friends kind of song. But if you look into the lyrics, it's about a guy who abandons his family. I mean, in the first couple of lines, I had a wife and kids in Baltimore, Jack. I went out for a drive and I didn't look back. I mean, right away, it's not a come on people now, smile on your brother type of song. It's a guy leaving his family. I mean, it's dark. And the rest of the verses are like that. It's just either the same guy or different people talking about being driven by a hungry heart that, at its root is probably a good thing, but if left unchecked becomes a beast. Sherry Darling is another good one. It's like this guy driving his mother-in-law to the unemployment office and just annoyed by how annoying she is and how ungrateful she is. Again, I don't consider this a perfect album. There are a lot of songs on here that, despite his good intentions in writing them, still leave me a little bit bored, for lack of a better word. Jackson Cage, Independence Day, even what I think a lot of people consider to be the crown jewel of this album, Drive All Night, by minute 8, I'm a little bit like, Okay, I get it. It's bathos. Again, it's bathos. And like that's where Springsteen loses me a lot of the time. The things I like about this album are numerous and deep. I like what it represents in the story of Springsteen's career. I like that it's that, bursting through the final wall of obscurity. I like where he's going with his compositions, technical simplicity, but narrative complexity and character complexity that you do really have to listen closely and look at the lyrics as he's singing it. But if you give it the time of day and you really allow it the focus that I am telling you it's worth, you'll get rewarded for it. This album is a lot more fun than Darkness on the Edge of Town. It doesn't sacrifice any of the darkness of that album, but it complements it with the kind of hopefulness that's mostly absent from Darkness on the Edge of Town. I still have listened to The Wild the Innocent more and just enjoy it more from an audience perspective than this one, but I think The River belongs just between Darkness on the Edge of Town and The Wild the Innocent and the E Street Shuffle in the A tier. 6, Nebraska. Bruce had plunged into a very serious depression after the release of The River, where I think he had done the rock star thing a bunch of times. He had made the rock album and done the rock tour and been heralded as the rock god that he always wanted to be. He had done it, and he still wasn't happy and fulfilled. When you reach that fork in the road where you're like, okay, I've got a lot of what I set out to get, and I'm still not happy, there's kind of two roads that fork off in front of you. There's the one of, I'm just going to do the same thing again, hoping that I get a different result. And then there's the other one of, I'm going to do something dramatically different and hope that the different approach yields a different result. I think the Rolling Stones career is almost an uninterrupted taking of the first road, and I'm a huge Rolling Stones fan. Nebraska is up there with Neil Young's Ditch trilogy as being a prime example of the other road, doing something radically different, and taking a big risk in doing so. He didn't tour in support of this album. There's very little on this album that, in its form as it exists here, would work as a radio single. Had he done a big band take of Atlantic City and released that, it probably would have, but not like this. And what you end up with is, a pretty lo-fi collection of songs that Bruce recorded as demos on a 4-track tape recorder in some house in far-off distant suburbia. This is a lot of people's favorite Springsteen album. When I say a lot of people, what I really mean is a lot of my friends who are either indie musicians themselves or who prefer to listen to indie music, people whose taste veers away from what's commercially popular. It's a lot of their favorite albums, I think, for the reason that part of its ethos is I'm not going to be commercially viable. I know that. I'm doing that intentionally. Deal with it. The problem with that take, in my view, is that from a pure songwriting perspective and from a production perspective, frankly, it's not the best Springsteen album. These are fine songs, and it is interesting the production format he elected for the release. But he's done better. He's done better before it, and he's done better after it. I think the gratitude people feel for this album is what it symbolizes. And, I feel that gratitude too. But I think that gratitude, gets in the way of people taking a more critical eye to the songs themselves. So let's do that. There's a few things that I really enjoy about the songs on this album. One is that it's probably the first time that Springsteen is writing really frank autobiographical songs. Autobiography seeped into his previous albums, but it was always through a sort of lens of universalization or fictionalization or something that kept them from feeling like real sort of first-person, true story Springsteen autobiography. My Father's House, there's nothing veiled about that. That's a song about Springsteen's relationship with his dad and how hard it is. Used Cars, Mansion on the Hill, likewise. These are autobiographical songs, and I like that. People in search of technical experimentation should be very gratified by State Trooper. State Trooper was inspired by a band called Suicide. I don't even know if I can say that on YouTube anymore, but that was the name of the band, and their music, if you have not heard it, is spooky as hell. The yelping Springsteen does is taken directly from the yelping that Suicide was doing on their albums. I have to say that I think Atlantic City is a little bit of an overrated Springsteen song. The band rendition elevated it to a sort of quasi-folk classic place that I don't really think it deserves. I don't think it's among Springsteen's best writing. It's good, but it's not. I wouldn't put it next to Badlands or Born to Run. The other thing, and this is a bit maybe a quirk of my taste, is that when I hear this album, I'm comparing it against other solo acoustic albums that I know and love, like the Freewheelin' Bob Dylan, for example, or like, a solo Doc Watson album or something like that. The fact is that Springsteen is not as gifted a solo performer as the best solo performers. He doesn't have a super dynamic or nuanced way of playing the guitar alone, and can compare it to Bob Dylan's guitar work on Good As I've Been to You, or Mississippi John Hurt's guitar work, or again, Doc Watson's guitar work. In terms of the sheer performance quality, I think Springsteen's solo acoustic performance is not quite on par with some of those others. I think most of the songwriting is good. Some of it is very good, and some of it is a little bit uninteresting. Highway Patrolman is the chief example of that to me. Like, it's a little bit of a cliched story about good and evil, and it's kind of the album's centerpiece, and I just don't think it is as good as its position on the album. The song Nebraska, I don't think, is as good of a character study of its main character as the movie Badlands is, and it's the same Charlie Starkweather at the center of the two works. I like most of the songwriting. I love some of it. If Dylan is a standard of excellence in solo performance, I wouldn't say it's excellent. What the album symbolizes is excellent. It symbolizes Springsteen's commitment to meaning and to taking, the right artistic step forward and not always in the direction of mass popularity. Cumulatively, I think this was the right album to make, that really does matter. And the songs, for the most part, are good and are songs that I reliably enjoy listening to. But isolated from that, I don't think it's the folk masterwork that it sometimes is considered to be. All in all, I would put it just behind Darkness on the Edge of Town in the A tier. 7. Born in the USA. Springsteen was working on Nebraska and Born in the USA simultaneously, and they could not be more different. Nebraska is an intentionally not commercially viable product. Springsteen looking inward, stripping away some of the rock trappings to make the album he felt he had to make, and that I agree he had to make. Born in the USA is the exact opposite of all of that. It is all of the rock trappings. It is as commercially viable as any rock album ever. It is the coalescence of everything that makes Bruce Springsteen a legendary rock artist. It is, consummately great songwriting. It is consummately energetic performance. It is production that walks the line between polish and ruggedness. And it has a social conscience that takes root in people, flesh and blood people, not nebulous ideals. When I was first getting into Springsteen, I considered its commercialism a little bit crass, and I thought that made it a lesser album than some of his earlier, more technically adventurous works. But the fact of the matter is, I think this is where Springsteen found the vein of art that he wanted to create. He grew up a disciple of 50s and 60s rock pop radio, and I think wanted to be for a big group of people what that music was for him. A source of energy, a source of hope, a source of redemption, meaning that went deeper than the sheer excitement of its surface. And this is where, goddammit, he did it. To write this album off because of its commercialism is really to just rob yourself of a lot of deep and magical artistic experiences. Yes, you can dance along just to Dancing in the Dark's groove. Yes, you can sort of pump your fist along to Born in the USA's big synth melody. Yes, John Mayer covered I'm on Fire. Yes, but these are not shallow songs. Born in the USA is a song about how mistreated Vietnam vets were when they got back to the country. Radio hits don't always have that kind of thrust. The single song that for some reason emblematizes what I love about this album is Darlington County. On a basic level, that song is just drunken barroom beach summer fun. But then on a deeper level, it is such an interesting, nuanced character portrait. It's a couple of guys who can't have fun in the city because they're not cool enough or not rich enough. So they get the hell out of there and they set their sights a little lower, which is so funny. I feel like most songs would be the opposite. Most pop songs would be the opposite. Let's go to the biggest place where the highest volume level of fun is happening and see what we can do there. This is the opposite. It's two guys trying to convince themselves that they're cooler than they are. Themselves and the girls that they're flirting with. If it's saying something, I guess it's saying that you can still have fun even if you can't have it all. And for the vast, vast, vast majority of Americans, especially blue-collar Americans, having it all isn't on the table. That's not one of the options. So like on the one hand, just on a feel level, this is a car you want to be in because of how fun the ride is. But then it is a deceptively nuanced and rich character study. They just wanted to feel like kings even though they know they aren't. What a compassionate thing to write about, especially as you're becoming the biggest star in the world. And I mean, I think that's an important point. Like, never does this album feel exploitative. It never feels like Bruce taking advantage. It feels like him wanting to be a reflection of what his audience is and to make his audience feel the kind of good that they need to feel. Again, it's a faith and trust with his audience that he got to because he thought really carefully about what kind of work he should be creating given the position he was in. I surprised myself a little bit by being so effusive about this album, but I love this album. I love it. It makes me feel like the rock fan that I've always wanted to feel like. At its best, rock can be a sacred thing, a dismantling of all the pomp and circumstance and trappings of the social world, of the commercial world, of the political world, just a stripping away of everything that makes us unlike one another, and an embrace of the fundamental things that make us alike. You know, that's what rock at its best can do, and this does it. I pretty unabashedly put this at the very top of Springsteen's S tier. 8. Tunnel of Love. True to form, Springsteen takes another step in a very different direction. I sort of think about it this way. Everything up through Born in the USA is Springsteen vying for the rock crown. And with Born in the USA, he got it. He was the king of the rock world, of the music world. He was the biggest thing on earth. He got what he set out to get. And then he had to keep going. He had to keep living. A way to think about it is that the first 10, 12, 13 years of Springsteen's career are him exploding outward, and then after that, it's a real coming inward and trying to reassemble the pieces of that explosion into something better, into the man that his father couldn't be, into the artist that artists who died early, like Jimi Hendrix, like Janis Joplin, couldn't be, because they got too addicted to the high life. Tunnel of Love is the beginning of him constructing an ideal self, a better self. Transparently, I find myself at a very similar juncture in my own life. I'm roughly the age that Springsteen was when he recorded Born in the USA. I'm a little bit younger, but not much younger. I find myself longing for some of those same things too, longing for a partner and longing for a home, you know, a family, the pillars at the center of a life that give it meaning, that can't be found externally. I find myself longing for some of those things. And when I listen to Tunnel of Love, I can see a man wrestling with all the same things that I'm wrestling with. I don't identify as much with the Jersey Shore sort of local short story collections like Darkness on the Edge of Town. I don't see myself in those songs so much. I love those songs, but I don't see myself in them. I do see myself in Tunnel of Love. I really see myself in these songs. This album is as daring as anything Springsteen has done in his career to this point. It's an exploration of male psychology, taking the typical conception of the alpha male and going, you know, that's not really working for me. What else can I do with that? How can I evolve from that to find something that will work for me? And like, again, an artist in Springsteen's position could have just ignored those kind of questions for his entire life. A lot of artists have. I mean, look at Axl Rose. I mean, a lot of people who achieve fame in any realm ignore those questions, you know, and just keep pursuing the same habits ad infinitum. Springsteen didn't want to do that. He wanted to grow. I too am a cautious man who, upon facing and taking leaps of faith, gets very anxious. I see myself in the song Cautious Man. I too am a little bit tougher to crack than the rest. You know, it's not as easy. It's not easy for me to dissolve into the supposed comforts of romance. My relationship with my dad is a lot smoother and easier and more abundant with love than Springsteen's relationship with his dad, but, you know, there's complexity there, and I think, you know, my dad has been quite successful in his own field. It's not a field that I'm in, but I admire the success my dad has had. There is an insecurity in me sometimes about, am I going to be able to live up to that in whatever field I choose to pursue and locate myself in? And even at a deeper level than that, what does it mean to be a man these days? I agree with the idea that the old conception of the alpha male is limited and wrong and violent in a lot of ways. I agree with that. It's demonstrably all those things. To say that it isn't is just to pull the wool over your own eyes. But so then it leaves a question, what is a man? I identify as a man. What is that? What kind of attributes should we be pursuing? What should we be holding on to? What should we be dispensing with? And how can we make those decisions thoughtfully and not sort of at the whim of the masses on either side of the argument? How can I do that? Those are things that I contemplate. I see myself and I see that reflection in Walk Like a Man. I could go on. I mean, Brilliant Disguise I see myself in. Two Faces I see myself in. Valentine's Day I aspire to see myself in. Yes, to some extent that is my individual experience with the album, but I also view it as evidence of the album's success in what it set out to do. To interrogate our conceptions of masculinity, to open the book on Springsteen's own romantic insecurities, and sort of to generalize man romantic insecurities overall. And in general, to paint a picture of love as non-simple. In any kind of popular art, love is generally depicted as a fairy tale thing. It's rare that you see a conception of love that is complex, that shows the complexity of a marriage, the complexity of the individual psychology that each partner brings to it, the types of things that each partner has to concede and allow and have patience for, and where to draw the line with that patience. Love is a complicated thing, I should know. This is the rare commercial product that explores that complexity honestly, thoroughly, and without pulling any punches. This album is not without some misguidedness. The 80s, I don't know what came over these people in the 80s, but the programmed drums feel pretty dead in comparison to the drums on Born in the USA. The Top Gun production, dare I say, of the title track feels a little silly, the sha-na-na-nas. Whereas Born in the USA is of its moment to some extent, but it's very out of it in other ways. It's very grounded in the 50s and 60s sound in a lot of ways. This one is so of the era that it's recorded in, and just like Dylan's Empire Burlesque or Neil Young's This Note's For You, it feels a little silly in retrospect. I'm so gratified by the depth of the songwriting that I can really let that go. I still notice it and it still bugs me a little bit, but it does not become a majority voice in my evaluation of the album. As you get older, you need something other than just youthful exuberance. You need something a little bit more nuanced and down to earth to comfort you in your moments of anxiety. Speaking for myself here, that's what I need. And this songwriting is deeper and more mature than the songwriting Bruce did as a young man. As much as Born to Run feels like the adrenaline rush you get when you are young and doing something exultant, Tunnel of Love is the palliative for the soul that you need when you are just beginning to look at middle age and wanting things that youth cannot bring you on its own. I would put this in the lowest part of Springsteen's S tier. 9. Human Touch. This album is generally considered to be Springsteen's worst studio album. The reality with this album is that most of the music is sort of just not that memorable. My hypothesis on why I think that's the case is that almost without exception, the first 8 albums of Springsteen's career, the concept, if you will, is different album to album. The same cannot be said for Human Touch. A lot of these songs sound like they could or should have been on a previous Springsteen album, but they don't feel like they have a unique position on a new Springsteen album. The Human Touch, the song, sounds like an outtake from the Tunnel of Love sessions. Soul Driver is the same. 57 channels and nothing on. It's as if he took the production approach to Nebraska and instead of using a 4-track recorder, used a professional studio. But it doesn't really feel of a kind with anything else on the album. It feels very much like an outlier. I think Springsteen's question in these years is, what is the next beast that I need to oppose with the strength of my artistry? The answer that he goes with here, which is kind of an underwhelming answer, is beasts that I've already defeated. The turmoil he faces in the midst of a committed romantic relationship is the primary one here. And again, it feels a little redundant in the context of Tunnel of Love. In essence, I like the title track, but my main gripe with it is there's no way it has to be a 6.5-minute song. There's no way. Especially as the first song on the album. It kind of sets you up for what the rest of the album is, which is a too long piece of work about the same thing he just wrote about 6 years ago, 5 years ago. The other context here is he released this album on the same day in 1992 as Lucky Town, another full album's worth of songs. The decision to release 2 albums at once probably made sense in the context of where he was at this point. He hadn't released an album of original music since Tunnel of Love in 1987, so it had been 5 years. So maybe he felt like his audience was ready for a larger than normal allotment of new original songs. Looking at it in retrospect without that context that I would listen in, I just disagree. From a purely artistic perspective, I don't think that release approach, that album structuring approach was the correct one. And, it's kind of the first time in Springsteen's career that I feel that way. I think it was correct to make The River a double album. I think it was correct to not make Nebraska and Born in the USA a single album, which he was thinking of doing. I think it was correct to make a real stylistic left turn after Born in the USA and not just try to make another Born in the USA. At this point, I think this was wrong. This was an incorrect step, and it yields a couple of inferior albums. There are probably 4 or 5 songs here that I think are good enough to listen to more than just one time. And that's kind of it. I would say this is the inaugural entry in Springsteen's D tier. 10. Lucky Town. Lucky Town is generally considered to be the superior of the 2 albums, and I agree with that, if only because it's the shorter of the 2 albums. On balance, I don't think it's any more inspired than Human Touch is. The difference probably between Human Touch and this one is that this one has songs that will periodically pop into my head. The song Better Days is actually very well written. There's some really fascinating lyrical turns in there. And I think the song Better Days really encapsulates the dilemma that Springsteen finds himself in the early 1990s. And the refrain, the These Are Better Days refrain, has both joyousness and grief in it. This is what I set up my career to get, and now I've got it. I both have a new purpose in my family, but I maybe have sacrificed that for purpose in my creative life, in my artistic life, or at least I don't have the old one, and I wonder if I'll find a new one. This album is kind of the beginning of a songwriting tendency in the latter portion of Springsteen's career, which I think yields uninspired songs. The example I'll give is Leap of Faith. Yes, it takes a leap of faith to enter into a romance, into any kind of long-term commitment. It's the kind of message you might hear from a preacher in church. What I think a lot of people mean when they say Springsteen songs get preachy at times is that they have a distinct moral or political point of view, which that doesn't bother me at all. What bothers me from an aesthetic point of view is when the core of the song is something you could read in a Hallmark card. It's also kind of a cliche. The term leap of faith, he didn't come up with that term. The idea that he's expressing in that song is not an original idea. It's a reiteration of a truism. Those are not things that I go to art for. Better Days is not a term he came up with, but he is casting it in this sort of ironic context of These Are Better Days, which I'm thrilled about on one level and a little bit grieving on another level. I would say roughly the same thing about Living Proof, about Book of Dreams, Souls of the Departed, and My Beautiful Reward. Living Proof is a beautiful song in the sense that it's a really impassioned song about the birth of his first child. It's a musically very uninteresting song. I find the vocal kind of strained. The difference between the validity of the motive of writing the song and the effectiveness of the execution of the song, good intentions do not a good song make. You've got about 3 or 4 songs here that are intrinsically fun and rewarding to listen to. You've got about that much on Human Touch. Altogether, I think you would wind up with kind of a B or B plus type of album. I don't think you wind up with a masterpiece, if only because all of the subject matter is subject matter that he's explored already in much greater depth and to much greater effectiveness. With the 2 albums together in the form that they're in, what you kind of get instead is perhaps an unintentionally effective depiction of an artist casting about for new inspiration, releasing too much material that resonates too little, hoping maybe that the volume of the material will account for its missing inspiration. And yeah, ultimately a couple of albums that in and of themselves are underwhelming. There is a lot that I enjoy on Lucky Town, and some of it that I enjoy on a deep level. But ultimately this album, like Human Touch, is in and of itself pretty underwhelming. I would put Lucky Town at the very top of Springsteen's C tier. 11. The Ghost of Tom Joad. This is essentially Nebraska Volume 2. I have such mixed feelings about this album. I've listened to this album in a number of different settings. I listened to it on the train where, there's a sufficient amount of background noise to drown out some of the album's finer points. I've listened to it walking around where I can focus a little bit more, but I don't have a lyric sheet in front of me that I'm reading. And I've listened to it alone in my apartment, looking at and reading the lyric sheet with me the entire time. By far, the most effective way that for me to listen to this album is that last approach, in as quiet as possible a setting with nothing to distract you, with the lyric sheet open in front of you. The reason you need the lyric sheet open in front of you is because you just cannot discern what he is saying half the time. That's not because the vocal is mixed too low or something, it's just that he's not enunciating. And you can tell that he took pains to write detailed songs. There's a lot of very interesting, novelistic details that are embedded in these songs. Like the travails of the guy in Straight Time, who wrestles so much with the idea of whether or not he can make it on the outside of a prison or whether he's going to fall back into a life of crime. Or like the two brothers in Sinaloa Cowboys, who go from struggling across the border to cooking meth with, fatal consequences for one of them, and what the other brother does in the wake of that. These are interesting stories with interesting characters who are pretty well fleshed out with the details that Springsteen put in the songs. I almost think it would have worked better as a collection of short fiction than as a collection of, sort of quasi-folk songs. The performances are just missing some characteristics that make solo acoustic or very stripped down song settings effective. Number one is you have to enunciate your lyrics. I have to know what you're saying. Another is just that the music is so simple and so samey throughout. At this point in Springsteen's career, you're a little bit starting to worry that he's only got 2 or 3 chord progressions in him anymore. The music song to song is so indistinguishable. Just like it does with Nebraska for me, it results in an album that has very little dynamic variation. There's an abundance of tenderness in these songs. There's an abundance of compassion, of care, of humanity. Springsteen's, political or social statements, if you want to call them that, are not grounded in nebulous ideals. They're not grounded in ideas of, it should be different, without being grounded in flesh and blood people. And this album is another good example of that. He has painstakingly created characters from whose circumstances you can infer political statements or social statements. But, moralizing is not the point of these songs. It's compassion. The point of these songs is to inspire compassion for groups of people who are right up against a conflict to which there is no easy answer, namely the border conflict. He's got songs about people on either side of the border, people who are trying to elude enforcement, people who are trying to enforce without compromising their values. He's got compassion for people on both sides of that dispute, which is illuminating the fact that really they're kind of on the same side. They're both just different players in a conflict that neither of them is responsible for creating, and we should have compassion for both of them. I really appreciate the compassion, the care, the thought, the effort that went into creating these songs. However, I think the execution of these songs is relatively poor. I need him to sing the lyrics he worked so hard on clearly enough that I don't have to invest all of my waking attention in getting them. I need him to cast the songs in a musical context that has a little bit more dynamic variation, musical complexity, so that the songs, resonate with the energy that they're supposed to resonate with. I sort of want him to pare away the songs that are a little bit more general, that are a little bit vaguer in their stories. Like Highway 29 is kind of vague in what happens in that story. Dry Lightning is a little bit vague in terms of what's going on in that. Like, I think pare away some of the songs that don't have that narrative specificity that makes the most effective songs so effective. I feel like a coach, and I mean, far be it for me to tell Bruce Springsteen what to do, but it frustrates me because there is so much I like about this album, and there is also so much that's so apparent to me that's hurting it, that I wish I could have, I wish I could have given him the feedback. I know that sounds ridiculous, but I do. Cumulatively, I think what I would recommend to people who have not listened to this album before is do it like I did. Give it at least one really hyper-focused listen. Listen to it like I did, alone in your apartment, when you're alert, and with the lyrics in front of you. And you will see and feel the compassion and the heartfelt attention that went into creating these songs. My gripes with how this album was executed are sufficient for me to put it in a relatively low place in Springsteen's studio album tier list. I would put it at the very top of Springsteen's C tier. 12, The Rising. What The Rising really is a cast for the bone in America that was broken by September 11th. As I was re-listening to this album, a big question in my head is a cast that was created for a past tragedy still relevant, decades after the tragedy took place? One answer is that you never really heal from a tragedy like that. Like, yes, Ground Zero has scarred over with new buildings and new art pieces and so forth, but the scar never goes away. You never really stop feeling soreness around the area you were wounded. And indeed, people's families, people's careers, people's lives were irrevocably changed by the events of that day. So, life perseveres, America has gone on, but it's impossible to ever stop feeling the ripple effects from that tragedy. But the other thing is that it's not like violence like this has stopped happening all over the world. I happen to be re-listening to this on a morning after the new violence in the Middle East started taking place. There are people who will argue that the violence is necessary. There are people that will argue that it's not necessary. But one thing we can all be sure of is that it will create new generational cultural pain for people. People will hurt as a result of it. And one of the main purposes of music is to dress and heal cultural pain like that. Whether it's Woody Guthrie writing about people fleeing Oklahoma in the Dust Bowl, or Rodriguez's songs being used in anti-apartheid movements, or gangster rappers rapping about police brutality. When a culture is wounded, it effectively sends up the bat signal for the musicians of the day to help address those wounds. I was listening to this album the day that new violence in the Middle East started taking place, and I was tremendously moved. The approach that Springsteen takes to writing about the tragedy on 9/11 is one that we should be familiar with by now, where he tries to view it from every human perspective imaginable, whether that's the spouses or the family members of first responders for 9/11, whether that's entire communities trying to rally and have a good time after 9/11, like in Mary's Place, whether that's the people who carried out the tragedy or tragedies like it, like in Paradise, where Springsteen writes from the perspective of a suicide bomber, whether that's from the perspective of somebody who died in a tragedy like this, which he does later in Paradise. Springsteen's effort here is to imagine every possible instance, iteration, incarnation of human pain that resulted from a tragedy like this, and to write into it, and in so doing, hopefully take a step toward healing it. Transparently, when I was listening to this a couple of weeks ago, I found myself weeping at the difficulty but necessity with which cultures have to rise after they've suffered a tragedy like that. Weeping at the atmosphere of lonesomeness that people have to breathe after something like this has taken place. And the sort of metaphor of the smoke billowing into the air, the ash, the dust billowing into the air after the attacks, that becomes the air that we all breathe in the aftermath. Somebody in the comments for one of these past videos was talking about the unity that Bruce Springsteen was trying to write about and kind of bring about via the Rising as being an impossible unity, a sort of idealistic unity that we'll never actually see. That may be true, but two things should prevent you from interpreting that as a reason to become more cynical. First of all of us have to continue living our lives in the aftermath of tragedy. You have no choice but to find a way forward. In order to find a way forward, you need something to be walking toward. You need a hopeful vision in order to move forward. And I think Springsteen's effort in this album is to create that hopeful vision, not necessarily to say that world peace, permanent world peace and world happiness is possible, but that there may be a sunny day ahead of you, and it's worth getting up that day to see if today's the day. The majority of this album moves me that way, and there are a few songs that move me in a particularly intense way. The first is The Rising. I watched this video of him performing it in Barcelona in 2002, I believe. Watching the way that he was playing guitar, just the sort of consistent, almost John Henry-like motion of his arm, it made me see him as like the American factories that he's spent so much of his career writing about. The production lines that are producing the backbone of America, the infrastructure of America, day in and day out, whether they want to or not. That performance of The Rising made me see him as a sort of factory of human hope, and not bullshit hope, not promises that will not come true, but promises that if you work toward them have a chance of coming true. It made me brim over with gratitude. The Rising was one. The second is Paradise. Springsteen has repeatedly made it a project in his songwriting to write from perspectives that are not easy to get into, like Charles Starkweather in The Serial Killer in Nebraska, or like his father, who in a variety of different ways was pretty abusive toward him, or in the case of Paradise, a suicide bomber, and then later in the song, the spirit of somebody who died who's visiting his former spouse. It's a riskier song than may meet the eye because it's talking about paradise as an empty promise, both for the person who commits atrocities like this under the promise that they'll get to paradise by doing it, but then also it's sort of poking a hole in the idea that the person is in a better place. I think it's saying that the best place is here together. The implication of that message is not that you should be hopeless that the person you love died for nothing, but that you have the blessing of still being here with your fellow humans, and therefore that you should seek to make this here now as good as it can possibly be. And then the one that I am most moved by is Into the Fire. Into the Fire is from the perspective of a spouse or a family member of a first responder who died in 9/11. The unifying image of the song is the first responder, instead of saving their own life, going upstairs into the deadly flames in the Twin Towers. And in doing so, making the ultimate sacrifice, putting their own life at risk and probably giving their own life so that they might have the chance of saving more lives than just their own. From a compositional perspective, I just find the refrain simple and moving in a way that many of the refrains on Tunnel of Love are, like two faces, two faces have I, upstairs into the fire. Very economy of language that just is right on the nerve of the thing it's talking about. The prayer of the song is just so intensely moving. I hope that the quality of your actions give you another life in all of us. The strength that you exhibit, the faith, the hope that you exhibit in making that sacrifice, I hope that we too can act in those ways, and in so doing, give you another life. If you lost somebody that day, or if you've ever lost somebody in a way that felt premature, you hope that their soul leaving the planet isn't the end of them, that you can carry them with you in some way, and ideally by carrying out their best qualities. And the additional reason why it was so moving to me that day is because I was thinking about, whether you feel that any of this violence is warranted at all. What continues to be true is that the people who order this violence to take place are not the ones who carry it out. And therefore, they are expecting normal people, citizens of their society who have filial piety, to make the ultimate sacrifice on their behalf. They're not sacrificing anything. They're likely only being enriched by moments like this. As you grieve the person you lost, you also feel this intense sadness at that dynamic, at the unfairness and, arguably the unrighteousness of that dynamic. Things to mourn, things to mourn. And this music gives you a channel by which to mourn those things. To the initial question of whether a cast that was made for a broken bone that has since healed is still as necessary as it was at that moment. In the case of The Rising, the answer for me is yes. It helps that I know Springsteen's story. It helps that I know what he was up against personally, artistically. It helps that for most of my life I've lived very close to, if not in, New York City, and so I feel the reverberations of those attacks in ways that others might not. And it helped that I listened to it at a moment when there was a new gash of global pain opened up by another series of rulers trying to make whatever points they felt needed making in the world. As I listen to this album now, its human points of view are as moving as I have to imagine they were when it first came out. Is it a little bit too long? Yes. Does it sound a little bit like a former rock legend trying to find a new rock sound and not always hitting the mark? Yes. I don't listen to this nearly as much as my favorite Springsteen albums, but I am as moved by its best songs as any Springsteen songs I'm moved by. I don't know of another more compassionate or more effective healing take on 9/11 from a major musician. I would put it in the very lowest place of his A tier. 13. Devils and Dust. Devils and Dust is largely compiled from songs Springsteen wrote and recorded in previous phases of his career, from as recently as the Rising Tour to as far back as the early 1990s. Perhaps surprisingly, this is one of his best sounding albums. He creates this atmosphere of incredibly warm, tender, intimate folk rock. It is probably as atmospherically rewarding an album as he's made since Nebraska. If you want good examples of it, I would go to Maria's Bed, All I'm Thinking About, or Madame Morris Banks. There are a number of issues I have with The Ghost of Tom Joad that are kind of fixed here. Some issues that aren't. It's still pretty tough to make out what he's saying, which is just so so irritating to me. It almost makes me feel like he's afraid of the lyrics he's written on some level, like that he's worried they're not profound enough, and that if he pronounces them clearly, people will pick up on that. Whether or not that's the case, it's like when a friend of yours is being a little bit too coy with you, like kind of intimating that they're having some kind of issue, but not being willing to just come right out and say it. And you're just like, I like you. I'm here because I like you. Tell me. Which does irritate me, I think, in large part because just like The Ghost of Tom Joad, there's a lot of nuance and care in these songs. You know, there's songs about encounters with prostitutes, there's songs about hired assassins, there's a song about a sort of majestic, wonderful horse. When you can make out the words, a really lovely paean to his children. There are some sort of repetitive musical motifs that recur throughout this album, and the production environment does get a little samey, but this is really one of Springsteen's coziest albums. It serves a purpose that, frankly, no album to this point in his career serves. Nebraska is a richly textured production environment, but it's also spooky and eerie and a little bit demonic. Devils and Dust really feels like sitting around the family hearth. The Rising is a more towering and important accomplishment. It had a kind of broader national, emotional, cultural motive than this one does. If The Rising is a kind of emotional documentary that you watch in order to put your experience in the wake of a tragedy in context, this album is the blanket that you put over your lap as you're watching the documentary. Are you with me? I would put this just behind Greetings from Asbury Park in the B tier. 14, We Shall Overcome, The Seeger Sessions. This is an album consisting entirely of covers of songs that Pete Seeger sang or popularized. Pete Seeger was a legendary songwriter and activist who you can see portrayed by Edward Norton in the recent Bob Dylan biopic. It's the first album of entirely covers that Springsteen released in his career, as opposed to somebody like Bob Dylan, who recorded albums either entirely or mostly consisting of covers throughout his career. This is an appropriate collection of songs in large part because post The River, Springsteen was largely calling on the folk tradition as inspiration for his new song. On Nebraska, that's very aesthetically obvious. The songs, sound and feel sort of like modern Woody Guthrie songs. But even on Born in the USA, I think you can hear that. The songs are pretty structurally simple, pretty technically simple, but seek to tell stories about human beings suffering from the kinds of issues that the singer is concerned with. I think there are sort of two fundamental pillars of value on this album. The first is that if you're relatively new to the folk songbook, this is a good sort of primer. There are a number of just sort of stone-cold folk classics on this album. John Henry, Shenandoah, We Shall Overcome. There are also a lot of songs here that are not necessarily super well-known classics, but that are just as wonderful to know about as those other songs. And the other pillar is that the album is just incredibly fun. Dylan's folk performances feel like an old folk singer that you happen to stumble upon in a coffee shop in the middle of nowhere. Very much the spirit of folk. It sounds like a disheveled, wandering ragamuffin who happens to be divinely talented. Springsteen's, on the other hand, feels like the most charismatic union leader you could possibly imagine. Somebody whom hundreds of thousands, millions of blue-collar workers will rally around as their galvanizing voice. Both of those personas have a sort of inherent folk credibility and realness that makes the songs come alive. All that being said, there are things I don't love about this album. I don't love Springsteen's affected Southern accent. I don't think it's inherently wrong for a person who does not have a particular accent to use a particular accent, especially when the person has a good understanding of the people who naturally have the accent that he's using. If the accent is a product of and proof of empathy, I think it's okay. If it feels more exploitative, I think that's where you get into trouble, where it's like if it's either making fun or it betrays a poor understanding of the people whose voices it's based on. That's when you sort of get in trouble. And in Springsteen's case, I don't think it's necessarily a poor understanding. I think it's more just that the accent is so clearly affected and so over the top that it's hard to suspend your disbelief like you would need to in order to believe that this person is the character. Besides which, I just don't think he needed to do that in order for the songs and the performances to sound credible. I almost wish he had had an acting coach who could have said to him, just dial it back 2 or 3 points. We get it, we believe you. You don't have to go that hard. I think my one other critique of it is that when the arrangements are good, it feels like the best big folk band that was ever assembled. But then when the arrangements aren't good, it feels kind of like generic folk rock. A certain kind of fiddle fill is played at this point because that's what you play at this point in this kind of song. I think at its worst, it can feel a little bit boilerplate. Even though, of course, it takes exemplary technical musicianship to deliver such boilerplate licks and arrangements, the sum total does occasionally feel that way. In general, this is an album that I reliably enjoy listening to. It spawned a really great live show. The Live in Dublin album is also very worth listening to. It's a great general education in folk music. It's a great sort of indication of Springsteen's own creative lineage, or one of the creative lineages that's important to him. It's for the most part incredibly fun. Sometimes it feels a little bit repetitive and predictable. This is another post-Tunnel of Love album that I think every Springsteen fan ought to give a chance, and ought to give, a pretty good and close listen, particularly if they have any kind of musicologist gene in their body. So if that's you, this is for you. Yeah, I would put this just behind Devils and Dust in the B tier. 15, Magic. There are a lot of songs on this album that bring me some kind of pleasure to listen to. Radio Nowhere is the best example of that. Imagine a world where Springsteen wrote Radio Nowhere in 1976. It has a kind of Because the Night energy that would have made sense alongside the other songs on Darkness on the Edge of Town. I think that had the song come out then, it would be regarded as a much more prominent classic than it is currently regarded as. Girls in Their Summer Clothes is kind of akin to I Wanna Marry You on the River. Long Walk Home is a sort of Reason to Believe type song, especially the way that he tends to play it in concert in a solo acoustic setting. He's doing a good job of reproducing styles that he's already done a good job of showcasing in the past. It's hard to say that the production is not an astute representation of the rock of the E Street Band, but it's also not necessarily a new representation of that. It's a little bit cleaner sounding and probably a little bit more complex and modern in terms of the ingredients it uses to create that representation. So what you wind up with is pretty expertly rendered rock music that is neither any better nor really any different than anything he's produced in the first 30 or so years of his career. People go too far in criticizing this music sometimes. Like they just sort of call everything post-Tunnel of Love sort of irrelevant or bad. This is neither irrelevant nor bad, but for somebody who's trying to wrap their head around what Bruce Springsteen is all about, it's also kind of a long way from essential. If somehow you were marooned on a desert island and this was the only album you had with you, I don't think that would be bad news at all. But if you had the choice to take a Springsteen album to a desert island, you would never choose this one. So that's an interesting dichotomy. There's nothing about it that feels essential, but there's also nothing about it that feels offensively bad. I would put it just ahead of The Ghost of Tom Joad in the C tier. 16, Working on a Dream. There are some new Springsteen sounds on this album. What Love Can Do almost sounds like a Guster song, similar with Life itself. Good Eye is borderline Tom Waits blues type energy. It's not nearly as gritty and dirty as that, but it's sort of hinting in that direction. Tomorrow Never Knows kind of has Lumineers type folk energy. There are also several songs from this album that I would probably put on a best of Springsteen post-1987 album. My three choices would be My Lucky Day, The Wrestler, and The Last Carnival. A good microcosm of what I don't love about this album is Outlaw Pete. Outlaw Pete is a song that is epic in size and scope. It is the life of an outlaw, from when he is 6 months old to when he rides his horse off of a cliff in a sort of freeze-frame Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid type of way. It is cinematic in its sweep. It is orchestral in its production. It is, by all accounts, a sort of epic Springsteen outlaw song. However, it is kind of just one outlaw song cliche after another. Robbed a bank, had an enemy, had a lover that he sort of abandoned and who searches for him in the stars and calls out his name. Compared to something like Nebraska is quite a nuanced character study of a real serial killer. This is a relatively cliched story of an imaginary outlaw that Springsteen did not do a lot of really deep imagination work in bringing to life. Not that I don't think it took a lot of work to make that song happen, but there's nothing nuanced about the depiction of Outlaw Pete, which, by the way, is like sort of a dumb moniker. What outlaw calls themselves outlaw? Working on a Dream is another example of that. Compare Working on a Dream to Darlington County. Darlington County is, again, I waxed about Darlington County because I love how unusual and nuanced of a portrait it is of people who have a big dream that they can't quite realize, so they take an alternate route. Working on a Dream is like taking the most generic explanation of what that song, or what a lot of the songs on Born in the USA are about, and turning it into the basis for a new song. Just like Magic, this is not a bad album, it's not a lazy album. There are some gestures in entirely fresh musical directions, but not any really bold experiments that feel like entirely novel territory for him. Maybe with the exception of The Wrestler. The Wrestler is actually a pretty good character portrait, perhaps because he had an entire good movie's worth of character data to work from. For the most part, these songs are less multidimensional,
reiterations of themes that Springsteen has been working on for his entire career. I would put this in the very lowest place of his C tier.
17. Wrecking Ball. Like 9/11 was for The Rising, the financial crisis was a good motivation for writing a protestful rock album. And yeah, fuck those guys. Fuck predatory bankers who were so addicted to greed and so addicted to artificially inflating their profit margins that they jeopardized the entire American economy and millions of people who don't have the financial leeway to survive a shock like this that they did. Fuck those people. I feel that. And so when he writes songs from that motivation and gives credible voice to those feelings, I find it very stimulating. In addition to that, you still want to feel like America is a place where if you do things the right way, you will be rewarded with a good life. A song like Land of Hope and Dreams, I feel like lives in that conflict, between wanting to be hopeful, indeed needing to be hopeful if you want to, commit yourself to a gainful life, but then also seeing all these reasons to challenge that hope with cynicism, but not wanting to give into cynicism. Land of Hope and Dreams comes directly from that nerve and is a really stimulating song to me. It's also emotional to hear Clarence Clemens' last solo on record for Bruce Springsteen. The songs that I like most on this album are the rockers, in particular the rockers that seem influenced by the Seeger sessions, songs that feel like modern recapitulations of the tropes of old folk songs. Shackled and Drawn and Death to My Hometown are the two that come to mind. Both of them sound like Celtic folk songs, and American Land really sounds like a Celtic folk song. But the subject matter is brought up to date. They're all clearly about the financial crisis of the late 2000s, and the production feels modern in a way that Springsteen's 2000s albums rarely feel. My favorite songs on this album are those songs that feel like good modernization of timeless folk song tropes. The songs on this album that I like the least are the ones that sort of verge into preachiness. And when I say preachiness, I don't mean taking a sort of moral high ground. What I mean is it literally sounds like a sermon, replete with gospel singers and references to Bible verses and biblical figures. Jack of All Trades, Rocky Ground, Land of Hope and Dreams all sort of have moments like that. Rock was definitely born partly from church influences, but there's a reason that rock isn't church. And the best songs on this album really do what rock can do for a beleaguered listener. The album is really hurt, I think, by the songs that take us out of the arena and put us into a pew in church. The other thing about this album that Springsteen actually pointed out in his memoir, in 2012, at least in America, rock music had less power to unify a society around a voice of protest than it did back in the 80s. I think both due to the impacts from streaming that I talked about in the intro, as well as probably people looking at Springsteen correctly as a member of the 1%, songs from Springsteen about financial strain are probably a little bit less believable than songs by somebody who's actually experiencing financial strain. I don't love that argument just because, Springsteen started out with nothing and he got everything by doing something noble. The bankers that these songs are about got everything by doing ignoble things. I mean, for starters, just living their lives strictly in the pursuit of money. That's ignoble. And then also within that, exploiting the system to such an extent that it almost destroyed the system, that too is ignoble. Springsteen didn't do either of those things. He got what he got by doing a noble service for an enormous audience all around the world, giving millions and millions and millions of people reason to believe. While I don't think that argument completely disqualifies him from writing those kinds of songs, at a minimum, there is just an element of yeah, but this isn't happening to you, though, that I think probably does reduce these songs' impact to some extent. On a strictly compositional level, there are a lot of really good, really rousing songs on this album that I genuinely look forward to listening to, and then there are a number of songs that kind of drag it. The ballads, Jack of All Trades kind of drags it. This Depression kind of drags it. Rocky Ground really drags it. The production in general is pretty fresh. It's the most modern production, I think, on any Springsteen record to date. Like The Rising set itself up to be a cast for the bone in America that was broken by September 11th, this album sets itself up to be a cast for the bone in America that was broken by the financial crisis. The circumstances of the music industry in general, coupled with Springsteen's own circumstances, both as an aging rock star and a very rich rock star, reduce the healing properties of that cast by just enough to make it feel like a less essential treatment option than The Rising was. But like, I genuinely look forward to listening to this album in a way that I don't look forward to listening to a lot of later Springsteen albums. I'm actually going to put it just ahead of Devils and Dust in the B tier. I just think its songs are more resonant, its production is just as stylistically effective, if not more so, and it's just a more cohesive artistic unit than Devils and Dust or anything beneath it, in my opinion. 18. High Hopes. Like Devils and Dust, High Hopes is a collection of songs from Springsteen's past, songs he wrote but never made a studio recording of, like American Skin, songs he did do a studio recording of but then took on new life in a live setting, like The Ghost of Tom Joad, a couple of covers, and then other original songs that just sort of never found a place in previous studio albums. The main difference that I see between High Hopes and Devils and Dust, which is its sort of spiritual predecessor, is that this album really lacks a sense of stylistic coherence. Somehow he pulled that off with Devils and Dust, which itself was kind of a hodgepodge of original songs, but the same effect is just not achieved on High Hopes. A good example is Harry's Place. Like, as an isolated track, I kind of love Harry's Place. I love the vocal tone that Springsteen finds. I love the cymbal part that plays in the bridge. I love the sort of megaphone EQ that he says the chorus in. I like that he swears. I think that's a really cool, really experimental late Springsteen track. It's a cool song, but it also has like nothing in common with any of the other songs on the album. American Skin could have been on The Rising, at least stylistically, if not in terms of its subject matter. This Is Your Sword and Hunter of Invisible Game could have been on Wrecking Ball, stylistically speaking, but together here as a unit, there's not really a thematic thread that runs through these songs in a way that makes them make sense as a group. For a like bootleg series type album, that's maybe less of a big issue, but for an album that's presented as a single studio album, it makes the whole thing resonate as a whole a little bit less. There are a number of songs on this album that I think are good and indeed really good. Harry's Place is super cool, American Skin is a very moving song, Heaven's Wall is kind of an awesome song, Frankie Fell in Love, while not great, is a sufficiently fun song. The Ghost of Tom Joad, the studio recording of this live rendition doesn't have the firepower that the live rendition does. It's like a cast recording of a Broadway album versus going to see the play in person. You know, you can get a sense of what the composition is like, but you can't appreciate the full effect of it without seeing the band live. I think it was smart of them to document it, but it doesn't have the same resonance as it would have in a live setting. I also wonder why they couldn't have just taken a live cut of that song and put it here. You know, I wonder if they considered that. There's this interesting thing about him covering Dream Baby Dream, which is a song by the band Suicide. Suicide was very instrumental in stylistically inspiring Nebraska. What's interesting about Dream Baby Dream, when Suicide does it, it feels suffused with cynicism and eeriness and paranoia and all of the things that made Suicide a singularly strange and disturbing and exciting band. Springsteen's version of Dream Baby Dream, he turns it into a Born in the USA song, whereas Suicide's rendition feels like it's sort of talking a junkie to death. Springsteen's rendition feels like encouraging, you know, a toddler to dream, to keep hold of their dream. It feels idealistic where theirs felt cynical. You know, on the one hand, that's kind of a cool artistic reimagining, but then on the other hand, it feels like it kind of betrays the central identity of the song, and I'm not quite sure how I feel about it cumulatively. In the comments of these videos, High Hopes has gotten a lot of hate. You know, people have referred to it as the worst Springsteen album, and I don't think that's remotely accurate. There are numerous Springsteen albums that I like listening to far less than I like listening to this album. Just like Wrecking Ball, I don't resent having to put this one on. I like listening to this album, but probably half of its songs are songs I would feel happy enough not to ever listen to again, and I really don't think it resonates as a unit the way that even something like Devils and Dust does. The raw enjoyment that I get from this album, as well as the way that its best lyrical moments stir me, I would put this just ahead of The Ghost of Tom Joad in the C tier. 19. Western Stars. Perhaps controversially, I would argue that Western Stars is Springsteen's most sonically adventurous album since Nebraska. The way that I would describe its sound, and this impression is aided by the album cover, which shares a lot of the thematic properties of the sound itself. It's almost like looking at old Western images through a Nickelodeon, or through like an old slide projector. Some kind of technology that does display the image, but that also mediates it. Modern technologies are so hyper-realistic in the way that they capture images. The technological limitations of older devices like older cameras, they impart a kind of mediating layer on the image that they're capturing. The sound of this album feels like it has that mediating layer, so that when Springsteen is writing about a hitchhiker, it doesn't seem like he's writing directly about it. It's almost like he's writing about the memory of what hitchhikers once could be. In general, it makes me wish he had done more of that on albums like Magic. You know, Magic I feel like is him trying to directly represent the sound that the E Street Band was capable of conjuring in 2006, 2007. The production on this album feels like it has an artistic attitude and point to make of its own. And he does it pretty well. I don't think this is the most exciting production of all time, but it definitely has an artistic bent that a lot of his previous albums from this general era lack. When there is a consistent and thematically satisfying production atmosphere on an album, it makes the whole album much more of a joy to listen through all the way. Even lesser songs like Sleepy Joe's Cafe, which I just kind of consider a dumb song, because they share that sort of intoxicating air of nostalgia and commentary on nostalgia, they're still satisfying to listen to. Aside from the production itself, compositionally, there are quite a few songs that I find very moving on this album. Hitchhikin', The Wayfarer, Chasing Wild Horses, Hello Sunshine is terrific, Moonlight Motel is really good. Possibly my favorite song on this album is Stones, because I think the lyrics in Stones are terrific. I woke up this morning with stones in my mouth. Those were only the lies you told me. I love the sort of impressionistic image of stones in my mouth. It's kind of a poetic depiction of the lies that whoever told them the lies told them. And then, those were only the lies you told me. Like that there's an intuition of other lies, or there is the known presence of other lies, but that somehow that extra pack of lies was not accounted for by the stones in his mouth. It makes me wonder about what was the context for that feeling of ashy, lifeless leadenness in his mouth that day. What provoked that? It speaks to my taste. Like, I like songs that imply the existence of a greater world in the song and in our world in general without spelling it out. Springsteen in a lot of cases is guilty of spelling it out too much and, reducing the room that my imagination has to roam. And I don't like that. So a song like Stones that really gives it a lot of room to roam, I really appreciate. Also, Somewhere North of Nashville is an excellent song. That could be a great Chris Christopherson song. It's compact like a great country song is. It has a believable character. It has a sort of emotionally moving setting and context. I would say about half of this album I find moving, if not very moving. And then the other half I find effective in production and less effective in composition. Yeah, Sleepy Joe's Cafe I find kind of dumb. Drive Fast, Fall Hard. I'm like, did you need 2 Stuntman songs on this album? Western Stars is a much more effective song. There Goes My Miracle, I just feel like plays in a bad soap opera. Not that I don't love the sort of operatic way that he sings that, and not that I haven't sung along to it in my car a time or two. Stepping back and trying to evaluate it objectively, I think it's a little bit too melodramatic for the emotional context that it establishes. Cumulatively, I would characterize Western Stars as a modest artistic experiment that is successful in its modest artistic ambition. It's not a dramatic experiment. It's not Tom Waits making swordfish trombones. It is Springsteen using the studio not just to depict the power of the E Street Band, but to act as an artistically mediating lens on the era of life and art in America that he's focusing on. I think I would put this just ahead of Wrecking Ball in the B tier, if only because Springsteen adopts the point of view of, I'm just gonna be an artist on this album, not a preacher. I don't need him to be a preacher. I need him to be somebody using his artistic apparatus to move and to soothe. That's what the best songs on Wrecking Ball do, and that's what this album cumulatively does. 20. Letter to You. As artists advance into their later years, it's very tempting to call all of their later work their mortality work or their death work or something. But in this case, there are some pretty strong signifiers that is how Springsteen wants us to think of Letter to You, in part because when he was on Stephen Colbert in 2020 promoting the record, he talked about mortality being a big influence. So that's the kind of inquisitive brain I have that I watch interviews and I say, so that's what it's about, huh? For better or worse, it does give us a clue into what's going on. In a similar way to Western Stars, whose production I think goes such a long way in giving the album a unifying conceptual thread, I do think that thinking of this album as a mortality album, as an end-of-life album, gives it a conceptual thread that makes it more satisfying to listen to as a unit. Which is fortunate for Springsteen because I don't think that the new songs on this album are all that good for the most part. The new songs on this album read like heartfelt, if not particularly stimulating poems that he set to relatively basic E Street Band type music and melodies. Look no further than the title track, for an example. On the one hand, I relate to what he's saying. I too have tried to write out documents like that to people I love or to people to whom I want to communicate something heartfelt and difficult to describe, and it takes a concerted writing session like that to do it. I get the experience that he's trying to conjure, but frankly, to me, the lyrics are a little bit awkward in the way that he phrases them and just a little bit basic in terms of the rhymes that he chooses. Like, he uses the word true to rhyme with you,
numerous times. From a content perspective, that's not necessarily inapt, but it just strikes me as, from a purely rhetorical perspective, a little bit basic given what I know he's capable of. And then the melody and the music that he puts the lyric to just sounds like a Born in the USA melody that was put into the washing machine 6 or 7 times and is by now a little bit faded. The song is moving to me on some level, but mechanically it is so understimulating that cumulatively it just doesn't move me very much. I would say almost identical things about half the songs on this album. Last Man Standing, The Power of Prayer, Ghosts, and I'll See You in My Dreams. I would say the same thing about all those songs. I do think 1 Minute You're Here is a very nice, tender song. And I think that House of a Thousand Guitars and Rainmaker both have musical aspects that are surprising and moving to me in a way that elevates them above those half dozen songs I referenced. Thinking of this album as a mortality album, I think Burnin' Train is a cool mortality song. I think you can read the refrain of Take Me On Your Burnin' Train and the way he sings it, the sort of invigorated way that he sings it, as a kind of eagerness about mortality. Like, okay, I'm ready. Let's move to the next phase of things. I can take it. Assuming that that's a remotely accurate read of that song, I think that's cool. So then there's the matter of the songs on this album that he wrote in the 70s and that he is now singing in his 70s. Janie Needs a Shooter, Song for Orphans, and If I Was the Priest. My feelings about those are basically that conceptually it's a cool move to do that. It adds to the theme of this being a mortality album, that he is, seeing his life flash before his eyes, if you will, by way of re-recording those songs. And additionally, in Last Man Standing and a couple of other places, it seems like he's writing about his earlier years and the things he went through as a much younger man. So, conceptually, I think it's a strong move to do that, and it does enhance one's ability to view this as a mortality album and therefore to listen to it as a more unified document than you might otherwise listen to it as. Wordy. But I don't think that the performances of those songs are particularly strong, honestly. It's unfortunately hard not to think of how powerful of a performer he was when he was in his 20s and 30s. He's still a very powerful, very devoted performer, but he doesn't have that same fire that he did when he wrote those songs. There's also a somewhat more nuanced reason that they rub me the wrong way, which is, by now the E Street Band sound is such well-trodden territory for them. They have such a clear idea of how to make it reach its aural peaks, about how to render it in the studio and so forth. They've done so repeatedly on numerous albums reaching all the way back to the 70s. So just, purely the sound on those songs is not novel territory anymore. It's pretty well-trodden, and so it doesn't hit as hard as it would have in the 70s when it was all brand new. In summary, the 70s songs, cool in concept, a little bit less cool in execution. Cumulatively, I think this is one of the only Springsteen albums that I feel this particular way about, where I think overall it's conceptually strong, and I like the atmosphere that concept creates, that sort of looking into the mist of mortality feeling. I like that. But I don't think either the songwriting or the production is particularly fresh, either on the new songs that he's written or the old songs that he's re-recorded. I don't particularly look forward to listening to this album, although I would isolate a couple of its cuts and put them on a best of Bruce in the 21st century. 1 Minute You're Here would be one, maybe Burnin' Train would be another one, but not too much else. I think I would put it just ahead of Lucky Town in the C tier. 21. Only the Strong Survive. This is Bruce's second album that consists entirely of covers. The Seeger Sessions was folk songs, and these are soul songs. There are a couple of things I like about this album. The first is sort of just the mission of it, if you will. I think the history of rock music, and the rock music in particular that Springsteen plays, gets kind of a whitewashed treatment. People will sort of pay lip service to people like Little Richard and Chuck Berry, black artists who really instigated the rock and roll movement, but most people's rock knowledge goes back only about as far as the Beatles. In other words, the first white artists to turn rock and roll into a really commercially viable form of music. I like that this album kind of seeks to do the opposite, to pay tribute to the black artists who are just as much vertebrae in the spine of rock and roll, if you will, as their white counterparts. Personally, with the Seeger Sessions, I had a fair amount of folk knowledge before listening to that album just by virtue of being a Bob Dylan fan and having investigated his influences. I did not have a whole lot of knowledge of this music before listening to this album, so for me personally, this was a very useful education. And also a fun education. It's not a didactic album at all where he's hectoring you or punishing you for not knowing this music in the first place. He's presenting it in a fun way for you to enjoy, and in the hopes probably that you go do your own investigation after hearing it, which I did. The other thing that for the most part I like about this album is that the production in his takes of these songs effectively cleans up the production in the original takes of the songs. I think you could argue that there's a certain charm to the production of, say, say, the original Hey Western Union Man, which if you listen to it is just not as finely developed and manicured as Springsteen's rendition of the song, probably because Jerry Butler and company did not have the time or the resources that Springsteen had when they were doing their original take. So, in a way, the production that he comes up with really cleans them up and presents them at full throttle in a way that the originals didn't for one reason or another. On the other hand, I do think you could argue that there's a charm to the roughness of the production of most of the originals that gets a little bit sanded over here. Again, I go back to the intention. The intention is definitely to spruce it up, to Bruce it up, to Bruce spruce it up, and he does, and for the most part I like that. So those are the things that I like. There are unfortunately things that I don't like about this album. It a little bit sounds like Bruce karaoke, which is also how I feel about Bob Dylan's Triplicate. It feels like he got the mic at a party for several hours and just sang all the songs he wanted to sing. And Bruce's takes here are certainly not dishonorable and certainly not disrespectful at all. He is trying his best with the instrument that he has to bring these songs to life, to give them new life, to Bruce them up, etc. But here's my thing. I think one of the most appealing features of great soul music is that it sounds like the singers are doing it almost effortlessly. Even when they're reaching for high notes, even when they're being emotive with their voices, it seems like they're doing it easily. It's just a sort of reshaped exhalation. It's just coming to and through them naturally, effortlessly, easily. Springsteen does not sound like he's doing this effortlessly. He sounds like, and he is, putting an enormous amount of effort into singing these songs. It's kind of a nuance, he is doing what he can with the instrument that he has. I think if there's one thing that rubs me the wrong way when I'm listening to him deliver these songs, it's that they feel so effortful. They feel strained in an almost Michael Bolton-ish way. And that strain, I think, does periodically choke the soul of these songs. In my experience listening to this album, that is a consistent mark against it that makes it a little bit less fun for me to listen to than the Seeger sessions. So, I think the intention is cool. I'm grateful for the education. I don't think he has as much of a gift for singing soul music as he does for singing folk/rock music. I'm overall grateful for this project. I'm glad I've spent some time listening to it, but I'm not as deeply enraptured by it as I am by most of the rest of his catalog. I think I would put it just behind Lucky Town in the C tier. There you have it. That's my Bruce Springsteen studio album tier list. Yes, I've omitted the Tracks 2 albums for now, and I think for good reason. He decided not to release those albums when he had the opportunity to. Releasing them as a sort of retrospective box set, I think the purpose of it is to add almost annotations to his official canon, if you will. Useful annotations. I'm sure I haven't dived as deeply into the box set as I eventually will, but I do think of it as supplemental material, just the way I think of Bob Dylan's bootleg series for the most part, as supplemental material. So, look at it. Does this align with your way of thinking? Does it not? Is there a good reason why it doesn't align with your way of thinking, or a bad reason? Let me know in the comments either way. I have a few reflections. I think the first one, sort of overarchingly, is that this has been such an enriching project for me. A lot of this music I knew very well coming into this. Some of it I didn't know very well at all. I had not listened to Human Touch very much. I had not listened to Working on a Dream very much. Am I happy that I did? Kind of. I think that the way we listen to music nowadays, especially the way that people my age and younger listen to music nowadays, is just not this way anymore. It's so fragmented. It's so one song at a time. It's with such apathy toward the person who wrote it or who sings it. It is just so interesting and so heartening to look at a human being who was consciously trying to evolve at the same rate as the world around him and put that evolution into song. It's very heartening. At least until the age when we're all AI supplemented cyborgs, we're all going to have to do that as well. That's what life is. At a minimum, the value is you get all this sort of, osmosis instruction about how you might evolve within the confines of your own life from doing a survey like this. You see him go from a young man with just seemingly boundless energy for experimentation on every level to a slightly less naive, slightly more mature young man who was writing into the heart of America as opposed to just sort of collaging all the images that he sees of America. You see a guy wrestling with depression on a couple of his albums, wrestling with romantic difficulties, wrestling with issues with masculinity, wrestling with the irony of his class situation, starting out with nothing, getting everything, but still feeling a sort of, sentimental connection to the people he grew up with who didn't get everything, who still have very little, and trying to figure out what kind of voice he wanted to be in the landscape of popular music into his later years. At its foundation, it's a man engaged engaging thoughtfully and sentimentally with the world around him as best as he can. Is it always perfect? Of course not. For nobody in no position is it ever always perfect. Not even, my friends, for Bob Dylan. But god damn it if he's not always doing his best. And that just makes me, it just makes me grateful. It just makes me grateful. And it makes me want to commit to a project like this. The first thing I want to say is that even if you're not doing it in order to share content on the internet, it's incredibly valuable to listen to music and to engage with art this way. If you find an artist who really resonates with you for one reason or another, listen to their shit. It took me, I started this in May, it took me 2 months or so to listen to his entire discography. You know, that in one way that's a long time, in another way that's a very small fraction of my life. It doesn't take as much effort as you might think to do this comprehensive of a deep dive into an artist with dozens of albums. It's not as effortful, it's not as much of a grind as you might think it is. For the most part, it's a pleasure. The more time you spend with the same material, the more intimately you're associated with it, and the more effortlessly you can uncover the nuances of it, the hidden treasures of it that you just can't get on a first listen. You just can't. So, for those of you who are inclined to listen to music this way, but are feeling that their brains have been hijacked by the dopamine-draining algorithms that we've all been hijacked by, you can do it. You can, and moreover, you should do it, I think. Okay, so a couple other reflections. Reflection number 1, Bruce is not a monolith. I think people think of Bruce Springsteen as a guy who writes these big, mid-tempo rock songs about blue-collar workers, and that's kind of it. And yeah, he's written a lot of those songs. Arguably, I think he's gone to that well too much in his career, but then again, like, it's an issue that hasn't gone away, so why not keep writing about it? Yes, he has written a lot of those songs, but people who say that I don't think have heard Greetings from Asbury Park, for example. These surreal, almost prog rock, imagistic renderings of urban youth. Or Tunnel of Love, which is an extremely vulnerable exploration of masculinity, particularly in the context of a committed romance. Or Nebraska, which is an absolutely gothic rendering of America's underbelly. Or Western Stars, which is both a depiction of and reflection on the feeling of nostalgia. What I think I can give people is that post-1987 or so, there was relatively little aesthetic variation in his songs. That is, they are a lot of mid-tempo songs written in major keys with these big, sort of anthemic diatonic hooks. There are simply too many to mention. I agree that in 20 or 30 years he hasn't varied that very much, and I wish he had. On the one hand, Bruce is a guy who has written some of the most optimistic songs about what America can be. You know, look at The Rising, you know, especially in the aftermath of a national tragedy. Songs whose mission is inherently optimistic almost to the point of idealism, which is, you know, namely that rock and roll can lift people out of national grief, or can help. On the other hand, he's a guy that's written some of the most cynical songs about America. I mean, Johnny 99 on Nebraska is a guy who believes he would be better off dead, and instead of going to prison, asks to be executed. Reason to Believe on the same album is not... It's not a song about wanting to give people a reason to believe. It's, I can't fucking believe people still find a reason to believe after all this bullshit, after this, you know, this system that is set up against them, this national context in which it's almost impossible to thrive if you grow up in a certain way. How do people find belief? You know, who is selling them this belief, and is it me? So, I mean, he runs the gamut from cynicism to optimism and idealism. Aesthetically, he runs the gamut from, you know, what is effectively prog rock to what is, you know, some of the most straight-ahead anthem stadium rock ever written. And within what is admittedly pretty repetitive aesthetic territory, the big mid-tempo diatonic songs I referenced a minute ago, within that there is quite a bit of lyrical and content variation. Reflection number 1, people say Bruce is a monolith. Bruce, on almost no level, save perhaps the aesthetic level, is a monolith. Reflection number 2, Bruce Springsteen made his last classic album in 1987, but that doesn't mean he made his last really good album or album that's worth listening to in 1987. This project kind of got me thinking about what the various levels of the tier really mean. The S tier is full of albums that are must-listens for anybody. The A tier, I think, is must-listens for almost anybody, in particular fans of this kind of music or this artist in particular. The B tier is like must-listens for big fans of this artist and should listen but could skip for everybody else. And then C and below is pretty much just for the hardcore fans with some isolated tracks that I think are must-listens for more people than that. But, you know, having said that, don't be misled by this hierarchical framework. Just because an album is low-rated by me doesn't mean there's no reason to listen to it. If you're a really inquisitive analytical listener, which I am, you can get a lot out of listening to an album that is a little bit substandard, or that doesn't doesn't stimulate you the way your favorite albums do. Reflection number 3. This project really required me to listen against my taste, and I am really glad that I did. What do I mean by that? My aesthetic taste in art across the board has been so shaped by Bob Dylan's work. I fell in love with his work at such an impressionable age and listened to so much of it, through my later teenage years, that it really shaped my aesthetic, the aesthetic lens through which I view the world. As a result, I tend to prefer evocative lyrics with enough ambiguity that the work of appreciating them has a lot to do with what's going on in the listener's imagination when they do. You can apply that principle across other art forms as well. I would say similar things about visual art and about film art. Just because of the way the brain develops, I'll probably always have that core preference, but listening this closely to a lot of music that falls outside of those parameters, like the song Into the Fire on the Rising, spending as much time as I now have with music like that has forced me to open up new channels of my heart, or new areas of my aesthetic palette that I wouldn't have opened up before had I not put myself through this project. Into the Fire is a heartfelt tribute to the first responders from 9/11. What it's basically saying is, I hope that, the spirit with which you sacrificed yourself, the faith, the hope, the strength that you exhibited in sacrificing yourself, I hope that we can embody those traits, and in so doing, give you a second life. And it's a beautiful sentiment. It's a beautiful prayer after a moment of seemingly senseless tragedy like that. You don't see a whole lot of that in Bob Dylan's catalog. He's got very few songs that are that heartfelt and straight ahead, and even the ones that he does have always feel a little bit winking, a little bit ironic. Forever Young comes to mind. On one level, it's a lot braver to write a song that has so little guile, so little irony. And I'm really glad that my palette has widened to include that flavor. I really am. And I hope not only that it influences me as a listener to music, but also a writer of music. In some of the songs that I've written recently, it certainly has. Listening against one's taste is a good thing, and just because something doesn't, immediately light up all of the dopamine receptors, or whatever the neurological term for those things are, just because it doesn't fry your synapses immediately, doesn't mean it's not going to grow you in some really elemental and constructive way. So there you go. I'm not done with Bruce Springsteen. There's a lot more that I've been thinking about from a mechanical perspective, from an overarching career arc perspective, that I'll likely cover in future videos. I may well do a sort of song-by-song analysis of some of the albums that particularly resonate with me in the S and the A tier. I will get into the Tracks 2 box set probably next, maybe with a little interlude of sorts to cleanse my aesthetic palette. But in summary, thank all of you for continuing to watch this series, continuing to offer your own comments and reflections. I don't have time, unfortunately, to respond to each one of them as thoughtfully as I would like to, but just know that I am reading them. I am trying to respond to everyone that I can, and I appreciate you taking the time to think and reflect as carefully as many of you do. Please continue to do so. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel. There is much more content where this came from. All right, onward and upward, and I will see you next time.